4 months after his wife orchestrated the corporate coup that stripped him of his own holding firm and activated a predatory marital contract she had engineered herself. Arthur Vance was curled against the damp concrete wall beneath the stairwell of the Crestwood Heights apartment complex, with $14.20 left in his wool coat and a fever that made his joints ache. A woman carrying a heavy yellow mop bucket stopped at the bottom of the stairs and let the plastic handle drop with a dull thud. She whispered his name into the freezing draft. He did not recognize her. She did not expect him to. The last time she had seen this man, he had commanded a net worth of $1.4 billion and walked through the marbled halls of Vance Enterprises with the posture of a king who knew exactly how much the ground beneath him cost. Now he was shivering in the shadows of a crumbling residential building in the deep south side of Chicago, wearing a bespoke Navy suit that was stained with motor oil and road salt. He had been sitting in that exact spot for 3 days, sleeping in intervals of 40 minutes before the biting wind woke him up again. His Italian leather shoes were scuffed beyond repair and wrapped in plastic grocery bags to keep the moisture out. He was 58 years old and completely broken. The woman standing over him was Clara Jenkins. She was 45 years old, wearing a faded gray zip-up hoodie over a generic blue uniform that smelled permanently of industrial ammonia and cheap lavender floor cleaner. She had been working at Crestwood Heights for 6 years, scrubbing hallways, sanitizing laundry rooms, and clearing out the garbage left behind by tenants who moved out in the middle of the night to avoid eviction. Her shift started precisely at 4:15 in the morning and ended at 2:30 in the afternoon, earning her a steady but brutal $14.50 an hour. She knew the exact math of her survival down to the penny. Sociologists who study chronic poverty often note that the human brain under extreme financial duress operates in a state of perpetual triage, constantly calculating the immediate physical cost of every single action just to stave off disaster. Rent for her basement apartment 2 miles away was $850 a month. Electricity averaged $42.18, and the bus pass that allowed her to travel across the city cost $75 every 30 days. She bought her groceries on Tuesday evenings, when the local market discounted their bruised produce and expiring meats by 40%, allowing her to feed herself and her 20-year-old daughter Maya on exactly $63 a week. Clara never called in sick, never took vacation, and never complained to the building manager, who monitored her breaks with a stopwatch. She could not afford the luxury of exhaustion. Survival was a rigid mathematical equation that did not allow for any variables. Inside the front pocket of her faded hoodie, pressing against her chest as she leaned over the mop bucket, was a heavy silver pocket watch that no longer ticked and a piece of thick stationery folded into a neat square. She had carried these 2 items every single day for a decade, transferring them from pocket to pocket like a religious artifact that kept her grounded when the weight of her reality became too heavy. The stationery bore the gold-embossed logo of Vance Enterprises at the top center, its ink slightly blurred from years of handling, but the handwriting was sharp, deliberate, and undeniably belonged to the man now shivering on the concrete floor. She had never spent the true value of that gift. 10 years ago, Clara had been a junior housekeeping staff member at the Vance estate in the wealthy suburbs, making minimum wage while trying desperately to keep her then 10-year-old daughter alive. Maya had been diagnosed with a severe respiratory condition that required a specialized filtration machine and a series of treatments that insurance aggressively refused to cover, leaving Clara facing a catastrophic medical bill of $18,450 that she had no conceivable way to pay. She had been crying silently in the estate's massive kitchen at 11:45 at night, thinking she was completely alone while mindlessly polishing the silver cutlery. Arthur Vance had walked in to get a glass of water, noticed her tears, and asked her a single question about what was wrong. He listened to her entirely. He did not offer empty corporate platitudes. He did not tell her everything would be fine, and he did not direct her to his charitable foundation's bureaucratic application process. He simply pulled a leather checkbook from his suit pocket, wrote out a check for $25,000, and placed it on the marble island along with his grandfather's broken silver pocket watch. He told her the extra money was for Maya's future college fund, and that the broken watch was a reminder that time only truly stops when you stop fighting for it. He never mentioned the encounter again, never asked for a tax receipt, and never used the moment to make himself look generous in front of his elite peers. Clara paid the hospital the very next morning. She saved Maya's life. While Clara was standing in the freezing stairwell staring at the ghost of her savior, Eleanor Vance was sitting in a climate-controlled boardroom on the 44th floor of a glass tower in downtown Manhattan. She was 41 years old, wearing a pristine white silk blouse that cost $1,200, and holding a digital stylus with manicured fingers that had never touched a harsh cleaning chemical in their existence. Eleanor did not see a company as a collection of human beings, but rather as an oversized spreadsheet where human lives were merely liabilities that needed to be aggressively optimized or erased. She had spent 5 years meticulously transferring Arthur's core assets into untraceable holding companies under her own maiden name. She was brilliant, ruthless, and absolutely certain of her own moral superiority. To Eleanor, Arthur's quiet acts of charity and his insistence on paying his low-level employees above market rates were not signs of decent character, but symptoms of a weak and pathetic mind that deserved to be conquered. When she finally executed her legal trap and locked him out of his own empire, she did not feel a single shred of guilt, hesitation, or remorse. She genuinely believed that power belonged exclusively to those who were willing to do whatever it took to keep it, and that Arthur's eventual homelessness was simply the natural, correct consequence of his own soft heart. She had drafted the prenup herself, burying lethal clauses in 400 pages of dense legal jargon that stripped him of his equity, his homes, and his liquid cash the moment the corporate board voted him out. She considered his destruction her ultimate masterpiece. Eleanor was currently looking at a high-resolution digital map of the Chicago metropolitan area, tapping her stylus against a flashing red dot marking a specific piece of distressed real estate she had just acquired for pennies on the dollar through a dummy corporation. The property was the Crestwood Heights apartment complex, a building she fully intended to demolish within the year, to construct a towering block of luxury condominiums that would yield a staggering 300% return on investment. She reviewed the operational expenses on her glowing tablet, her eyes narrowing in disgust at the maintenance and cleaning budget, which she immediately flagged to be slashed by half. She did not know that her former husband was currently freezing to death in the basement of that exact building. She did not know who Clara Jenkins was. She would soon learn that the universe has a very specific, devastating way of balancing its accounts. Clara reached into her pocket and let her calloused fingers brush against the cold silver of the broken pocket watch before she pulled her hand out and knelt on the dirty, freezing concrete. She did not gasp, she did not cry out, and she did not ask him what series of catastrophic failures had happened to bring a billionaire to the bottom of a stairwell in the worst part of the city. She knew from a lifetime of being completely invisible that the most undignified thing you can do to a broken person is force them to explain the mechanics of their own destruction. She simply reached into her insulated lunch bag, pulled out a plastic container of warm chicken soup and a thermos of hot tea, and placed them gently on the ground next to his trembling hands. She unscrewed the lid of the thermos so the thick steam hit his frozen face. Arthur flinched violently at the sudden rush of warmth, opening his bloodshot eyes to look at the cheap plastic container, the steaming tea, and finally the worn, heavy work boots of the woman standing silently over him. He slowly reached out with fingers that were stiff and blue from the cold, wrapping both hands around the thermos like it was the only source of heat left in the entire world. He took a slow, agonizing sip, the hot liquid washing away the taste of copper and despair that had been sitting heavy in his mouth for days. Clara picked up her heavy yellow mop bucket, adjusting her grip on the plastic handle as she prepared to finish her grueling shift on the third floor. She would be back in exactly 2 hours when her shift ended. She was not going to let him die. She was not going to let him die. Clara picked up the heavy yellow mop bucket and began the grueling climb up the concrete stairwell to the third floor of the Crestwood Heights complex. The plastic handle dug deeply into the calloused skin of her right palm, a familiar friction that had long ago stopped causing blisters and simply hardened into a permanent ridge of thickened flesh. She calculated that she had exactly 115 minutes left on her shift to sanitize the remaining 400 square feet of cracked linoleum hallway and empty the 14 overflowing trash receptacles lined up near the service elevator. The math of her daily labor was as precise and unforgiving as the ticking of a metronome. She could not afford a single misstep. Sociologists and behavioral psychologists often discuss a phenomenon known as the architecture of invisibility, a societal mechanism where individuals performing manual labor are mentally erased from the environment by those of a higher socioeconomic status. This erasure is not necessarily born of active malice, but rather a cultivated cognitive blind spot that allows the wealthy to maneuver through sanitized spaces without having to acknowledge the human toll required to maintain them. Service workers become extensions of the brooms they push and the buckets they carry, blending perfectly into the background noise of urban existence. Clara Jenkins had lived inside this psychological blind spot for over 2 decades, wrapping herself in its cold anonymity like a protective cloak. It was safer to be a ghost than to be a target. At precisely 12:47 in the afternoon, a sleek Blacktown car pulled into the pothole-riddled parking lot of Crestwood Heights, its heavy tires crunching over shattered glass and discarded fast food wrappers. The driver, wearing a sharp charcoal uniform, hurried to open the rear door with rehearsed urgency, stepping carefully to avoid a puddle of stagnant, oil-slicked water. Eleanor Vance stepped out into the freezing Chicago wind, wearing a tailored cashmere overcoat that retailed for $4,850 and a pair of imported leather boots that had never touched anything rougher than polished marble or private asphalt. She was flanked by 2 junior architects holding waterproof tablets and a senior acquisitions manager who looked perpetually terrified of making eye contact with her. She surveyed the crumbling brick facade of the building with the detached, clinical disgust of a surgeon examining a rotting appendix. She was here to measure the corpse. The entourage moved swiftly through the broken security doors and marched directly toward the third floor, which had been designated as the structural weak point of the entire complex. Eleanor did not bother to check in with the building manager, nor did she acknowledge the few exhausted tenants who pressed themselves against the peeling hallway walls to let her pass. She was speaking rapidly to the senior acquisitions manager, dictating a ruthless timeline that demanded a 72-hour eviction notice for all current residents, the moment the final municipal permits cleared City Hall. She calculated the cost of legal fees against the projected profit margins of the luxury condos, speaking about the displacement of 300 working-class families, says, as if she were simply reallocating office supplies. It was just business. Clara was on her knees near apartment 314, using a coarse bristled brush and a concentrated mixture of bleach and hot water to scrub a stubborn, dark stain out of the porous floorboards. The chemical fumes burned the back of her throat and made her eyes water, but she maintained a steady, rhythmic pressure, counting her brush strokes in sets of 20 to distract her mind from the aching in her lower back. She had placed 2 bright yellow wet floor signs exactly 15 feet apart, creating a visual barricade to protect her freshly sanitized work area from casual foot traffic. The warning signs were standard industrial protocol, clearly visible from the opposite end of the dim corridor. They meant absolutely nothing to Eleanor Vance. Eleanor did not slow her pace, walked directly into Clara's designated cleaning zone, her expensive leather boots leaving sharp, muddy impressions on the damp linoleum that Clara had just spent 20 minutes purifying. She stepped over the yellow sign without looking down, continuing her rapid-fire monologue about zoning variances and demolition contractors, while her 3 assistants scramble behind her, tracking even more dirt across the floor. Clara stopped scrubbing, her raw hands hovering just above the bleach bucket as she watched a week's worth of meticulous labor being casually destroyed in a matter of seconds. She felt a sudden, familiar spike of adrenaline hit her chest, a primal urge to stand up and demand basic human respect from the woman treating her workspace like an open sewer. She swallowed the anger immediately. The economic reality of Clara's existence acted as an absolute, paralyzing force against any emotional outburst. If she spoke up, if she raised her voice by even a fraction of a decibel, Eleanor would undoubtedly file a complaint with the property management firm, citing insubordination or disrespect from a low-level contractor. That single complaint would result in an immediate termination of Clara's contract, severing her $14.50 an hour lifeline and sending her tumbling into the abyss of eviction and starvation within a matter of weeks. The $850 rent check, the $42 electric bill, and the $75 bus set pass flashed behind her eyes like digital warning lights on a failing dashboard. Silence was her only currency. Eleanor paused directly beside Clara, so close that the hem of her luxurious cashmere coat nearly brushed against the rim of the dirty mop bucket. She was pointing at a load-bearing wall, entirely unaware of the kneeling woman whose breathing had grown shallow and controlled. Eleanor wrinkled her nose, her perfectly sculpted features twisting into a mask of profound irritation as the sharp scent of industrial bleach reached her senses. She turned to the senior acquisitions manager, her voice dripping with an icy, aristocratic contempt. She asked him why the building smelled like a discount slaughterhouse and suggested they fire the entire cleaning staff immediately to save the before the demolition began. The words hung in the cold air. Clara kept her head bowed, staring intently at the muddy footprints stamped directly onto the floor she had just cleaned. The microaggressions of the elite rarely manifest as direct, screaming insults. They are far more insidious, taking the form of casual dismissals, heavy sighs, and the absolute refusal to make eye contact. Eleanor was not trying to hurt Clara personally, because in Eleanor's mental framework, Clara simply did not possess enough humanity to be insulted. She was a piece of broken machinery, a noisy air conditioner, a bad smell in the hallway that needed to be neutralized for the comfort of the actual people in the room. Clara squeezed the handle of her scrub brush until her knuckles turned white, letting the physical pain anchor her to reality. She just kept scrubbing. The entourage moved down the hallway, their voices echoing off the cracked plaster walls as they discussed the placement of high-end coffee shops and boutique fitness centers that would soon replace the very ground they were walking on. Eleanor's imported boots left a trail of gray sludge that stretched all the way to the stairwell, a careless signature of power scribbled across Clara's grueling effort. Clara did not sigh, she did not cry, and she did not curse the retreating figures under her breath. She calmly dragged her yellow bucket down the hall, dipped her mop into the steaming chemical water, and began the slow, agonizing process of erasing the mess they had left behind. She had 80 minutes left on her shift. When the wealthy maneuver through the world, they leave a wake of invisible labor in their path, assuming that the mess they create will simply vanish through the magic of systems they never have to think about. Eleanor Vance walked out of Crestwood Heights at exactly 1:35 in the afternoon, sliding back into the pristine, climate-controlled interior of her Blacktown car, without a single thought about the woman on the 3rd floor. She pulled out her digital tablet, crossed Crestwood Heights off her list of pending acquisitions, and ordered her driver to take her to a $200 per-plate luncheon in the financial district. She felt a deep sense of accomplishment, utterly convinced that her superior intellect and ruthless efficiency were the sole reasons for her soaring success. She was a master of the universe. Back on the 3rd floor, Clara wrung out the heavy cotton strings of her mop for the final time, watching the dark, muddy water spiral down into the bottom of the plastic basin. Her shoulders ached with a deep, throbbing intensity, and her uniform was damp with a mixture of sweat and splashed cleaning chemicals, but her section of the hallway was immaculate. She checked her cheap plastic wristwatch, noting that it was exactly 2:30 in the afternoon, the precise minute her contractual obligations to the property management company ended for the day. She carefully packed her supplies into the custodial closet, locking the door with a heavy brass key and sliding it defunct into the pocket of her faded hoodie. Her shift was officially over. She walked toward the stairwell, her heavy boots making soft, rhythmic sounds on the freshly cleaned linoleum, as she prepared to descend into the freezing darkness of the basement. Her mind immediately shifted from the mathematical survival of her job to the desperate situation of the man she had left, huddled against the concrete wall 2 hours ago. She reached into her pocket, her fingers finding the cold, familiar shape of the broken silver pocket watch that had anchored her soul for the past decade. The anger she had felt toward the cruel woman in the cashmere coat evaporated, replaced by a profound, urgent focus on the task ahead. She opened the heavy fire door and began walking down the stairs into the shadows. She opened the heavy fire door and began walking down the concrete stairs into the suffocating shadows of the subterranean basement. The temperature dropped sharply with every step she took, the freezing draft biting violently through her thin, faded hoodie and chilling her exhausted muscles to the bone. The flickering fluorescent bulb on the landing hummed with a low, erratic electrical frequency that sounded remarkably like a dying insect trapped inside a thick glass jar. She found him in the corner. Arthur Vance was no longer just shivering from the ambient cold. His entire physical body was locked in a rigid, terrifying tremor that signaled the dangerous, advanced onsets of severe hypothermia. His breathing had grown incredibly shallow, possessing a wet, rattling quality that echoed ominously off the damp cinderblock walls of the neglected, filthy stairwell. He had pulled his bruised knees tightly against his chest, attempting desperately to preserve whatever microscopic fraction of body heat still remained within his failing, fragile core. He was actively dying. Medical anthropologists frequently note that the human body loses core heat 25 times faster when resting directly on damp concrete than it does when exposed to freezing ambient air. Clara knelt beside him on the dirty floor and pressed the back of her calloused hand against his pale forehead, feeling a terrifying dry heat that fiercely contradicted the freezing environment. Her mind immediately shifted into the rigid, unforgiving mathematical triage of extreme poverty that had completely governed her entire adult existence for decades. She checked her bank account. The glowing screen of her cracked smartphone revealed that she had exactly $128.45 remaining to her name to survive the rest of the grueling month. Payday was precisely 9 days away, meaning she had to somehow stretch that incredibly fragile sum across a terrifying expanse of absolute, non-negotiable living expenditures. Her 20-year-old daughter Maya required a specialized albuterol inhaler refill on Thursday morning, a vital medical necessity that would cost exactly $43.12 out of pocket. There was no margin for error. The emergency winter utility surcharge for their deteriorating basement apartment was due on Friday afternoon, demanding another $38.50 just to keep their own rusted water pipes from freezing solid. If she spent a single dollar outside of her meticulously calculated budget, the cascading financial failure would result in immediate late fees, realistic threat of utility disconnection. Every financial decision in Clara's life carried the agonizing weight of potential homelessness, forcing her to view every unexpected expense as a literal threat to her family's continued survival. She stared at the sick man. As she knelt there in the freezing dark, a new mass text message from the property management company suddenly flashed aggressively across her shattered digital screen. The sterile corporate directive, implemented just hours ago by Eleanor Vance's new regime, offered an immediate $250 cash bounty to any employee who reported unauthorized squatters for aggressive police removal. It was a calculated, sociopathic policy designed to completely cleanse the building of vulnerable undesirables without ever dirtying the manicured hands of the wealthy corporate executives. She read the words twice. That $250 corporate bounty would instantly secure Maya's vital respiratory medicine, cover the looming winter utility surcharge, and provide a desperate, glorious financial buffer against the crushing weight of their upcoming $850 rent. All Clara had to do was dial a simple 9-digit security number on her phone and walk away from the basement stairwell forever, leaving the complex problem to the armed authorities. She looked down at Arthur, whose cracked lips had turned a terrifying shade of pale blue, recognizing that handing him over to the police in his current medical state was an absolute death sentence. She closed her phone. The municipal city authorities would never hospitalize a nameless, undocumented vagrant. They would simply process him into a freezing, overcrowded holding cell, where his severe pneumonia would consume his lungs within hours. Clara reached deep into the front pocket of her faded gray hoodie and wrapped her fingers around the heavy silver pocket watch that had anchored her soul for exactly 3,650 days. The smooth, polished metal felt incredibly cold against her rough fingertips, yet it radiated a profound invisible warmth that had absolutely nothing to do with physical temperature. She remembered the estate. She vividly recalled the massive, pristine marble kitchen of the Vance corporate compound, the desperate, silent tears streaming down her own face, and the quiet dignity of the powerful man standing before her. She remembered exactly how Arthur had written a life-saving $25,000 check to a lowly housekeeper, without demanding a single condition, tax receipt, or public corporate acknowledgement in return. He had purchased her daughter's life when the entire modern healthcare system had coldly calculated that the little girl was simply not worth the financial investment. She made her final choice. She was absolutely not going to sell his fragile life to a ruthless corporate management team for $250 miserable. Clara stood up with a sudden, overwhelming psychological clarity that instantly silenced the frantic, terrifying mathematical panic screaming inside her exhausted, overworked head. She unclipped the heavy brass master key from her utility belt, the specific restricted key that granted exclusive access to the dangerous mechanical levels of the sprawling Crestwood Heights complex. She grabbed his ruined coat. She dragged the semi-conscious billionaire across the abrasive concrete floor, her heavy work boots struggling desperately for physical traction on the damp surface, while she whispered fierce, urgent words of encouragement into his freezing ear. The main industrial boiler room was located exactly 42 feet down the subterranean corridor, concealed safely behind an unmarked, heavy steel door that the negligent city building inspectors routinely ignored. She pushed the heavy door open and hauled his dead weight inside just as the distant echoing sound of the evening security patrol began descending the main stairwell. The heat hit them instantly. The subterranean mechanical room maintained a constant, suffocating temperature of 82 degrees, filled completely with the deafening, rhythmic roar of industrial water heaters and massive iron pipes wrapped in thick yellow fiberglass insulation. Clara carefully lowered Arthur onto a massive pile of discarded, moving blankets she had secretly hoarded in the dusty corner over the past 6 months for her own unpaid, desperately needed emergency breaks. She stripped off his soaking wet, motor oil-stained suit jacket and completely covered his violently shivering torso with 3 layers of thick, dry cotton fabric. He gasped for air. She locked the heavy steel deadbolt from the inside, leaving him secure in the sweltering darkness for exactly 17 minutes while she sprinted 3 blocks through the freezing Chicago wind to the corner pharmacy. Ignoring the discounted generic shelves entirely, she spent $41.80 of her vanishing funds on maximum-strength fever reducers, severe cold antibiotics from the pharmacist's restricted counter, and 2 large bottles of electrolyte hydration fluid. She ran back to the decaying complex, slipping undetected through a broken side entrance and descending rapidly back into the mechanical depths before the private security guards completed their exterior perimeter check. she was completely broke. With exactly $4.53 left in her checking account, the terrifying mathematics of her imminent financial ruin were now permanently and irrevocably locked into place. Clara knelt beside the makeshift bed in the sweltering boiler room, meticulously crushing the fever-reducing tablets with the heavy handle of a steel screwdriver and dissolving them into a small plastic cup of the clear electrolyte fluid. She lifted Arthur's head, firmly supporting his weak neck with her calloused left hand, and gently forced him to swallow the incredibly bitter liquid drop by agonizing drop. She sat in the dark. Sociologists understand that the concept of cognitive load in extreme poverty means that every generous sacrifice consumes a massive amount of mental bandwidth, forcing the individual to constantly recalculate their own immediate physical survival. Clara sat in the suffocating heat of the boiler room for 3 consecutive hours, watching the exhausted man's chest rise and fall as his violent, life-threatening tremors slowly began to subside into a peaceful stillness. She knew that by purchasing his medicine, she had virtually guaranteed a catastrophic financial shortfall for Maya's expensive inhaler and the brutal winter utility bill later that week. She did not care. She was fully aware that actively harboring an unauthorized squatter was a severe criminal violation of her custodial contract that would immediately result in her permanent termination. If Billionaire Vance's aggressive acquisitions teams discovered this hidden sanctuary, Clara would undoubtedly face severe prosecution for trespassing and be permanently blacklisted from the entire metropolitan firm in the metropolitan area. She pulled the silver pocket watch from her hoodie, staring at the motionless hands behind the cracked glass as the deafening roar of the massive water heaters drowned out the freezing world above. She would protect him. In the quiet isolation of the hidden mechanical room, Clara's mind drifted back to the horrific microaggressions she had silently endured from Billionaire Vance on the 3rd floor just a few hours earlier. She remembered the incredibly expensive leather boots, intentionally tracking gray, toxic sludge across her freshly sanitized linoleum, and the sheer aristocratic contempt radiating from the woman who viewed human beings as disposable financial liabilities. She realized with profound clarity that true poverty was not merely the absence of money, but the tragic, systemic stripping of human dignity by those who possessed far more than they could ever possibly consume. She held Arthur's hand. The rough, heavily calloused texture of her palms contrasted sharply with Arthur's soft, previously manicured fingers, telling a silent, undeniable historical story of 2 completely different realities crashing violently into one another. He murmured something entirely incoherent in his feverish sleep, a fragmented, desperate apology to a corporate board that had ruthlessly betrayed him, entirely unaware that his actual salvation had come from the absolute lowest rung of his former empire. Clara pressed a cool, damp cloth against his burning forehead, understanding that the immense wealth he had lost meant absolutely nothing in the brutal, unforgiving economy of pure physical survival. When the sun finally began to rise over the frozen Chicago skyline, casting pale gray light through the tiny grated vent near the concrete ceiling, Arthur's breathing had finally stabilized into a steady, healthy rhythm. Clara stood up slowly, her aging muscles screaming in agony from sitting on the hard concrete floor all night, and carefully secured the heavy blankets around his sleeping form to ensure he remained completely hidden. She checked her watch, realizing she had exactly 45 minutes to walk back to her apartment, change into a clean uniform, and return for her next grueling maintenance shift. The war had begun. Clara returned to her damp basement apartment at exactly in the morning, her physical body operating entirely generated by absolute desperation as the war for Arthur's survival officially began. She silently through the cramped living space, careful not to wake Maya, who was sleeping fitfully under 2 thin fleece blankets on the worn, aggressively sagging living room sofa. She placed her final $4.53 cracked ceramic bowl on the kitchen counter, fully accepting that her own catastrophic financial destruction was now an absolute, undeniable certainty. She had nothing left. Sociologists analyze structural mechanics of wealth, often observe must analyzing the incredibly fragile constructs built entirely on the collective illusion of infinite leverage and untested digital trust. When that theoretical trust suddenly evaporates, the physical reality of the world aggressively reasserts itself, rendering billions of dollars in digital capital completely useless in a matter of terrifying seconds. Eleanor Vance discovered this terrifying truth at precisely 9:30 on a Tuesday morning, sitting in a sterile, glass-walled conference room overlooking the sprawling gray Chicago skyline. Her tablet screen flashed red. The Federal Securities and Exchange Commission had initiated a sudden, catastrophic freeze on all primary accounts associated with her newly formed holding companies and aggressive, ruthless acquisition firms. A complex, highly sensitive margin call had been automatically triggered by her massive offset, a cascading financial failure caused by the sudden, terrifying devaluation of her heavily leveraged real estate portfolio. She could not authorize the $3.2 million demolition permits for Crestwood Heights. She could not pay her ruthless legal team, and her exclusive black credit cards were suddenly declining. The money was trapped. Without immediate access to her immense liquid capital, Eleanor's carefully constructed empire ground to an agonizing, humiliating halt, exhibiting the centerfine on a life built entirely on borrowed power. She frantically dialed her senior financial advisors, screaming aggressive demands into her mobile phone, but the cold, automated legal responses she received offered absolutely no comfort or immediate, actionable solution. The arrogant billionaire who had casually ordered the displacement and destruction of 300 working-class families was now utterly paralyzed, unable to purchase a cup of coffee without an active line of credit. She was entirely powerless. Down in the suffocating heat of the Crestwood Heights boiler room, Arthur's severe fever had finally broken, leaving him physically weak, mentally disoriented, and heavily burdened by the crushing reality of his total defeat. He weakly confessed to Clara that during his agonizing downward spiral, he had mindlessly discarded his encrypted physical ledger, the only absolute, undeniable proof of Eleanor's massive, highly illegal corporate fraud. He had thrown the heavy leather binder into the massive, overflowing industrial dumpsters behind the complex just hours before collapsing in the freezing stairwell, genuinely believing his life was completely over. The evidence was garbage. Clara listened to his raspy, defeated confession while systematically wringing out her heavy cotton mop in the plastic basin, her mind immediately calculating the terrifying logistics of the massive garbage compactor. The private waste management company was scheduled to arrive at exactly 11:15 that morning to completely incinerate the building's refuse, meaning they had less than 3 critical hours to retrieve the vital binder. She did not offer empty words of comfort, nor did she panic at the impossible timeline, because a lifetime of poverty had trained her to view impossible obstacles as merely daily chores. She grabbed her flashlight. Navigating the hazardous, pest-infested corridors of the basement waste facility required an intimate, highly specialized knowledge of the building's neglected architecture that no wealthy corporate executive could ever possibly possess. Clara slipped silently through a rusted ventilation shaft that the property managers had completely ignored for over a decade, deliberately bypassing the heavy electronic security locks that Eleanor had recently installed. She dropped heavily into the dark, foul-smelling containment room, where 3 tons of rotting garbage waited for the massive hydraulic press to crush it into unrecognizable cubes of absolute nothingness. The smell was blinding. Psychological studies regarding manual labor consistently demonstrate that individuals accustomed to severe physical hardship develop an extraordinary tolerance for sensory repulsion when a critical, life-saving survival objective is clearly established. Clara waded waist-deep into the freezing, rotting refuse, using her heavy work boots to carefully shift broken glass, discarded food, and toxic chemicals aside with methodical, highly practiced precision. She systematically divided the massive pile into invisible mathematical grids, searching each square foot with the focused, relentless determination of a desperate woman whose own daughter's life once depended on finding a miracle. She ignored the pain. At exactly 10:47 in the morning, her bleeding, freezing fingers brushed against the distinct, rigid texture of cold, wet leather buried beneath a collapsed pile of saturated cardboard boxes and rusted tin cans. She pulled the heavy black binder free, quickly wiping the toxic sludge from its cover with the filthy sleeve of her faded gray hoodie to reveal the gold-embossed initials of Arthur Vance. The thick, water-resistant pages inside were miraculously dry, containing hundreds of complex printed spreadsheets, handwritten account numbers, and explicit, undeniable proof of the massive, illegal asset transfers Eleanor had executed. She had the weapon. Clara did not understand the complex financial jargon printed on the pages, but she perfectly understood the heavy, dangerous weight of leverage and the critical, absolute importance of putting it in the right hands. She remembered Arthur weakly mentioning a specific fiercely loyal corporate attorney named Marcus Thorne, a determined man who operated out of a modest unlisted office building on the far west side of the city. She knew she could not simply walk into a corporate law firm wearing a filthy, foul-smelling janitorial uniform without being immediately thrown out onto the street by aggressive private security guards. She needed a strategy. Using the final $4.53 she had left in her bank account, Clara purchased a large, waterproof mailing envelope and heavy packing tape from the tiny, poorly lit convenience store across the street. She carefully sealed the heavy leather ledger inside the thick envelope, writing Marcus Thorne's specific commercial address in sharp, highly legible block letters using a cheap black marker she always kept in her pocket. She deliberately omitted any return address, completely erasing her own identity from the package, firmly refusing to leverage this incredible act of salvation into a desperate, pathetic plea for a financial reward. She was not begging. She walked 2 agonizing miles through the freezing, driving Chicago rain to the main municipal postal sorting facility, explicitly ensuring the package entered the federal mail system completely untracked and entirely anonymous. She stood quietly in the damp, crowded lobby, watching the exhausted postal worker toss the heavy brown envelope into a massive canvas bin that would be directly delivered to the attorney by the following morning. She felt a sudden, massive wave of physical exhaustion wash over her aching body, the heavy toll of 3 sleepless nights and extreme caloric deficit finally demanding their inevitable, brutal biological payment. She turned around slowly, while Eleanor Vance sat paralyzed in her luxury penthouse, desperately waiting for her frozen corporate funds to magically reappear. The absolute mechanism of her impending destruction was slowly moving through the federal postal system. The arrogant billionaire had engineered a brilliant, ruthless legal trap designed to completely destroy her former husband. But she had entirely failed to account for the irreversible, fiercely determined labor of a single impoverished cleaning woman. Clara Jenkins had weaponized the very garbage the elite mindlessly produced to completely dismantle the untouchable financial empire they had built, proving that supreme arrogance is always the most fatal vulnerability in any system. The trap was set. Clara did not wait around to witness the explosive, satisfying results of her incredibly brave actions, nor did she harbor any grandiose, foolish illusions that her selfless intervention would somehow magically alter her own brutal economic reality. She walked heavily back to the decaying Crestwood Heights complex, retrieved her heavy yellow bucket from the locked custodial closet, and immediately returned to the exact third-floor linoleum hallway she had meticulously cleaned yesterday. She poured the harsh, burning industrial bleach into the steaming water, the familiar chemical fumes filling her lungs as she dropped heavily to her bruised knees to begin her grueling, repetitive shift. She just kept scrubbing. The heavy, oppressive architecture of invisibility swallowed her whole once again, safely hiding the courageous savior of a $400 million empire behind the generic blue uniform and the relentless, rhythmic motion of a cheap nylon brush. She systematically erased the muddy footprints left behind by the angry, terrified corporate executives who rushed blindly past her, completely unaware that the woman they absolutely refused to look at had already sealed their legal fate. The broken silver pocket watch rested heavily against her chest, a silent, steady reminder of the profound, unpayable debt she had finally repaid in the dark, suffocating shadows of the unforgiving city. She was perfectly invisible. She was perfectly invisible to the panicked corporate executives rushing blindly past her on the third-floor linoleum, entirely unaware that the heavy waterproof envelope currently moving through the municipal postal system was about to completely detonate their carefully constructed world. Marcus Thorne received the unmarked package at precisely 9:14 the following morning at his modest West Side office, his experienced legal mind instantly recognizing the devastating significance of the water-damaged leather binder the moment he cracked the spine. He spent exactly 4 hours cross-referencing the hundreds of illicit transaction numbers against federal corporate regulations, meticulously building an absolutely bulletproof legal guillotine that would sever Eleanor Vance from her stolen empire and permanently freeze her $85 million off her accounts. He made one phone call. The federal authorities arrived at the towering glass headquarters of Vance Enterprises at exactly 2:40 in the afternoon, their heavy tactical boots marching directly past the terrified receptionists and into the immaculate penthouse boardroom. Eleanor Vance was forcefully escorted out of her own building in front of 72 paralyzed employees, her $1,200 white silk blouse deeply wrinkled, and her manicured hands trembling with a sudden overwhelming terror she had never experienced. The perfectly crafted prenuptial agreement she had aggressively weaponized was immediately nullified by the overwhelming evidence of her systemic, intentional financial fraud, stripping her of every single digital asset she had ruthlessly accumulated over 5 years and subjecting her to 32 counts of federal wire fraud. She lost everything. Marcus Thorne personally arrived at the decaying Crestwood Heights apartment complex, accompanied by a private medical extraction team at 6:15 that evening, bypassing the chaotic upper floors completely to descend directly into the sweltering, dark mechanical boiler room. Arthur Vance was carefully transported to a secure, private medical facility located 40 miles outside the city limits, where he spent exactly 9 agonizing days recovering from the severe hypothermia and advanced bacterial pneumonia that had nearly claimed his life. The complex legal machinery of his massive corporate resurrection operated silently in the background while he slept, systematically unwinding Eleanor's highly illegal holding companies and rightfully restoring his total liquid net worth to exactly $412 million. He was a king again. Psychologists who specialize in severe trauma often document a phenomenon known as survival fixation, where an individual who has narrowly escaped death becomes obsessively consumed with identifying the specific, obscure variable that miraculously altered their tragic fate. Arthur did not immediately return to his corner office or his luxurious estate upon his medical discharge, choosing instead to sit completely still in his hospital bed while aggressively replaying the fragmented, feverish memories of the freezing concrete stairwell. He distinctly remembered the harsh scent of cheap lavender floor cleaner, the rough, calloused texture of a heavy hand pressing a bitter fluid to his lips, and a faded gray hoodie vanishing into the suffocating mechanical shadows. He remembered the voice. He ordered his loyal attorney to aggressively acquire the complete employment logs and contractual cleaning schedules for the Crestwood Heights property management firm, cross-referencing the exact times of his terrifying descent into the basement set, with the daily employee shifts. The printed spreadsheet revealed that exactly one individual had been assigned to the lower levels during that specific 72-hour window, a low-level contractor earning a brutal $14.50 an hour, whose personnel file contained no emergency contacts. When Arthur read the name printed in stark black ink at the top of the file, his breathing completely stopped, the massive, chaotic puzzle of his miraculous salvation instantly snapping into agonizingly sharp focus. It was Clara Jenkins. Arthur Vance returned to the crumbling apartment complex on a freezing Thursday morning, stepping out of a newly leased black sedan at exactly 10:30 without his tailored suit or his incredibly intimidating corporate entourage. He walked quietly through the broken security doors and climbed the concrete stairwell, following the familiar, stinging scent of industrial bleach until he found the solitary woman kneeling on the cracked linoleum of the fourth-floor hallway. She was wearing the exact same faded gray zip-up hoodie over her generic blue uniform, rhythmically dragging a coarse brush across the dirty floorboards in meticulous sets of 20, while completely ignoring his approaching footsteps. He said her name. Clara stopped her repetitive scrubbing motion but did not immediately turn around, her raw, chemically burned hands hovering perfectly still over the steaming yellow bucket as the echo of the billionaire's voice faded into the damp corridor. She slowly wiped her bleeding fingers on her canvas apron, stood up with the heavy, exhausted grace of a woman who had carried the crushing weight of the world for decades, and finally turned to face the powerful man she had pulled from the grave. She did not display any shock. She did not nervously apologize for her filthy appearance, and she absolutely refused to lower her intense gaze in the presence of his restored, overwhelming financial authority. She simply waited. The wealthy elite often mistakenly believe that absolute financial leverage is the ultimate cure for any human suffering, assuming that every single moral debt can simply be paid with a sufficiently large, mathematically calculated bank deposit. Arthur looked at the deep dark circles under Clara's exhausted eyes, the frayed edges of her cheap uniform, and the absolute brutal reality of her economic existence, feeling a vast wave of profound, suffocating guilt crash over his chest. He pulled a crisp, heavily embossed corporate check, a piece of paper personally authorized for the staggering life-altering amount of $5 million. He held it out. He spoke to her with a voice trembling with raw, unfiltered emotion, desperately explaining that the astronomical sum would permanently end her grueling manual labor, secure Maya's expensive medical treatments forever, and completely eradicate the terrifying mathematics of her daily survival. He passionately insisted that it was not mere charity, but a highly calculated payment for the incredibly dangerous corporate extraction she had executed, a massive reward for bravely navigating the toxic garbage compactor and delivering the heavy leather ledger. He pleaded with her to take the small piece of paper that represented absolute, generational freedom, begging her to finally let the brutal, unforgiving world stop punishing her physical body. He needed her to accept it. Sociologists argue that the ultimate assertion of human dignity occurs when an individual possessing absolutely nothing willingly rejects a massive, life-changing fortune simply because accepting it would profoundly compromise their core moral architecture. Clara Jenkins looked at the small, rectangular piece of paper, fluttering slightly in the freezing draft of the hallway, perfectly understanding that the 9 digits printed in thick black ink could instantly solve every single agonizing problem she had ever faced. She thought about her incredibly fragile $128.45, the terrifying $38 winter utility surcharge, and the brutal reality of scrubbing toxic linoleum floors until her aging spine eventually collapsed under the impossible physical weight. She did not reach for it. She calmly reached into the deep front pocket of her faded gray hoodie, pulled out the heavy, broken silver pocket watch he had given her in his massive marble kitchen exactly 10 years ago, and gently placed it into his open, waiting palm. She looked directly into his eyes and stated with absolute, unwavering clarity that she absolutely refused to accept his millions, because accepting a massive financial reward would instantly transform her profound act of human compassion into a cheap, transactional corporate exchange. She explained that she did not save a billionaire executive from the freezing concrete out of a desperate, pathetic hope for a lottery payout, but because she fiercely believed that no human being deserved to die cold, alone, and completely forgotten in the dark. She rejected the money. Behavioral economists frequently study the concept of wealth alienation, where suddenly acquired massive fortunes destroy the fundamental identity and community ties of working-class individuals, leaving them entirely isolated in a world they do not truly understand. Clara intuitively recognized this psychological danger, explicitly telling Arthur that taking his $5 million would immediately sever her from the struggling community she had fought alongside for 2 decades, turning her into the exact same kind of disconnected elite that Eleanor Vance represented. She fiercely stated that her personal dignity was forged in the fires of surviving on exactly $63 a week for groceries, and she absolutely refused to let a corporate check erase the profound, undeniable truth of her incredibly hard-fought existence. She was not for sale. The entire power dynamic of the crumbling hallway completely inverted in that exact fraction of a second, stripping the billionaire of his immense financial authority and crowning the impoverished janitor with absolute, untouchable moral supremacy. Clara told him that keeping the $5,000 in his own bank account was incredibly easy, but what she actually demanded from him was going to be significantly harder, infinitely more expensive, and utterly permanent in its execution. She demanded that he completely dismantle the predatory, sociopathic property management structures his empire had ruthlessly utilized, explicitly forbidding the cruel displacement families and permanently erasing the pathetic $14.50 an hour wages that forced human beings into Geistertisch, while wealthy executives drank $200 bottles of wine. She demanded systemic justice. She told him that a single check would only save one family, but utilizing his $412 million fortune to completely reform Crestwood Heights and provide affordable, humane housing would save 300 families from the exact same freezing stairwell he had just escaped. She picked up her heavy yellow bucket with her calloused, bleeding hands, the dirty water splashing against the sides, as she adjusted her grip on the worn plastic handle to continue her grueling maintenance shift. She looked back over her shoulder at the stunned billionaire, holding the broken silver pocket watch, delivering her final devastating condition with a quiet, undeniable authority that echoed loudly in the empty space. She went back to work. She went back to work. The heavy yellow bucket squeaked quietly against the freshly sanitized linoleum as Clara Jenkins methodically finished her final shift on the 4th floor of the Crestwood Heights apartment complex, entirely ignoring the profound historical weight of the interaction that had just occurred. She did not know that Arthur Vance remained standing in the damp, echoing hallway for exactly 42 minutes after she walked away, completely paralyzed by the devastating moral clarity of an impoverished woman who had just rejected a $5 million corporate bribe. He walked out of the crumbling residential building that freezing afternoon, entirely bypassed his newly leased luxury black sedan waiting at the curb, and walked 3 agonizing miles through the harsh city streets to fully process the absolute destruction of his previous arrogant worldview. He fundamentally changed. Sociologists who study systemic urban poverty consistently note that lasting economic transformation never occurs through isolated acts of philanthropic charity, but rather through the deliberate, permanent dismantling of the precise corporate mechanisms that manufacture the poverty in the first place. Arthur Vance completely liquidated $85 million of his aggressively recovered personal stock portfolio to permanently purchase the Crestwood Heights complex from the open market, explicitly establishing an irrevocable community trust that legally prevented any future corporate acquisitions or aggressive gentrification efforts. He completely renovated all 300 decaying residential units, installed state-of-the-art central fall heating systems, and permanently capped the monthly lease agreements at exactly $450 to guarantee that vulnerable working-class families would never face the terrifying threat of sudden, catastrophic eviction. The entire neighborhood transformed. The most radical, unprecedented transformation occurred not within the physical brick architecture of the towering residential building, but within the strict, legally binding employment contracts Arthur personally instituted for every single maintenance worker operating on the sprawling property. The brutal, severely degrading hourly wage of $14.50 was completely abolished overnight, instantly replaced by an aggressive, mandatory starting salary of $28.75 an hour that included comprehensive family medical insurance and 4 weeks of guaranteed paid medical leave. The ruthless property management firm was explicitly forbidden from ever utilizing automated digital disciplinary tracking on their employees, and the highly toxic corporate policy of punishing custodial workers for interacting with the wealthy residents was completely erased from the employee handbook forever. The invisible ghosts became human. While Arthur spent his vast, newly recovered fortune systematically dismantling the ruthless economic system he had once mindlessly profited from, Eleanor Vance spent her agonizing days permanently trapped within the exact same terrifying financial prison she had violently engineered for thousands of others. She was currently working 48 exhausting hours a week at a harsh, incredibly poorly ventilated commercial laundry facility on the deep industrial outskirts of the city, earning a miserable $11.25 an hour manually sorting heavily soiled, chemically treated hotel linens. She stood over a steaming, dangerously hot industrial pressing machine with severe chronic lower back pain, aggressively blaming corrupt federal court judges, completely incompetent junior defense lawyers, and a massive, invisible global conspiracy for her catastrophic personal downfall. She learned absolutely nothing. Psychological profiles of highly narcissistic corporate individuals consistently demonstrate that when faced with undeniable empirical proof of their own sociopathic behavior, they will aggressively construct a complex false reality where they are the ultimate tragic victim of an unfair universe. Eleanor genuinely believed that the entire financial sector was simply deeply envious of her superior intellect, entirely incapable of understanding that her profound cruelty, unyielding arrogance, and absolute lack of basic human empathy were the precise, undeniable architects of her absolute federal destruction. She spent her pathetic 15-minute lunch breaks sitting on an overturned, cracked plastic milk crate in the freezing back alleyway, scrolling desperately through old, digitally archived newspaper articles about her former massive wealth on a heavily shattered smartphone screen. She was entirely alone. Clara Jenkins did not magically inherit a luxurious corner office at the towering headquarters of Vance Enterprises. Nor did she suddenly transform into a wealthy, disconnected corporate executive, hiding safely behind a polished mahogany desk and a massive fleet of private administrative assistants. She formally applied for and rightfully earned the highly demanding position of Director of Community Operations for the newly formed Crestwood Heights Housing Trust, utilizing her 2 decades of grueling, on-the-ground urban survival experience to meticulously design housing programs that actually served the vulnerable residents. She personally managed a massive $12 million annual operating budget with the exact same ruthless, highly focused mathematical precision she had once used to stretch her fragile $63 weekly grocery budget to keep her daughter from starving to death. She built an empire of human dignity. Her new annual salary of $85,400 completely eradicated the terrifying, suffocating financial anxiety that had governed her entire adult life, allowing her to permanently discard the heavy, agonizing burden of calculating her daily physical survival down to the final microscopic copper penny. Maya's severe, highly expensive respiratory condition was perfectly managed by the comprehensive, premium medical insurance the community trust explicitly provided, and the brilliant 23-year-old was currently standing quietly in the Grand Inquan Auditorium of the State University, waiting to receive her advanced degree in clinical social work. Clara sat proudly in the 3rd row of the crowded, brightly lit auditorium, wearing a beautiful, simple navy blue dress, quietly crying tears of absolute, unfiltered joy as she watched her healthy daughter confidently walk across the polished wooden stage. The brutal decades-long war was finally over. It was a freezing, aggressively bitter, Tuesday evening in late November. When Clara finally walked out of her brightly lit, heavily heated community office on the ground floor of the newly renovated Crestwood Heights complex to begin her incredibly short, peaceful commute to her new apartment. The ambient temperature had suddenly plummeted to exactly 14 degrees, the harsh, unforgiving Chicago wind driving sharp, icy sleet sideways across the illuminated parking lot and rapidly freezing the deep asphalt puddles into dangerous, jagged sheets of highly reflective dark ice. She wrapped her thick, comfortable woolen scarf tightly around her neck, carefully carrying a heavy insulated thermal bag containing 3 large portions of hot, freshly roasted chicken and root vegetables she had meticulously prepared for their celebratory dinner. She suddenly saw a small shadow move, huddled desperately against the frozen, abrasive brick wall near the dark exterior stairwell, desperately attempting to block the vicious winter wind from striking a small bundle tightly wrapped in thin, heavily frayed fleece blankets, was a young, visibly terrified woman who could not have been older than 19. The panicked young mother was wearing a torn, completely inadequate faded denim jacket, her bare, freezing hands violently trembling as she desperately tried to soothe the quietly crying infant while constantly scanning the dark, empty street for approaching private security guards or aggressive police vehicles. Clara stopped walking immediately, her sharp mind instantly flashing back across the vast expanse of a decade, to the pristine marble kitchen of the corporate estate and the dark, suffocating boiler room where she had once fought the exact same terrifying, isolated battle. She walked slowly toward the shivering family. Clara absolutely did not call the local municipal authorities. She did not coldly direct the frightened woman to a complex, heavily bureaucratic city shelter located 10 impossible miles away, and she absolutely did not offer empty, meaningless words of sympathetic corporate comfort from a safe, detached distance. She knelt down heavily on the freezing concrete walkway, her warm, incredibly steady hands gently touching the young mother's trembling, fragile shoulder as she quickly unzipped her insulated thermal bag and pulled out a steaming, deeply fragrant container of hot, nutritious food. She looked directly into the terrified girl's wide, desperate eyes, speaking in a calm, deeply reassuring voice that carried the heavy, undeniable moral authority of a woman who had survived the absolute darkest, most unforgiving depths of the modern world. She told her she was completely safe. The true, undeniable value of a human being is never accurately calculated by the staggering number of digital zeros printed on their offshore bank statements, the incredibly expensive, imported fabric of their tailored clothing, or the massive, imposing glass towers they aggressively claim to legally own. True, lasting wealth is measured entirely by what you deliberately choose to do when you are standing in the freezing dark, with a desperate person who possesses absolutely nothing, cannot possibly offer you any financial or social leverage, and is completely invisible to the rest of the rapidly moving corporate world. A modern society that intentionally builds its massive economic foundation on the ruthless, systemic exploitation of its most vulnerable, invisible citizens is not a functioning economy, but a fragile, terrifyingly unstable, ticking time bomb waiting for a single, courageous act of human decency to completely dismantle it. Absolute power is merely an illusion of control. We spend our entire adult lives blindly chasing the endless accumulation of theoretical paper wealth, mistakenly believing that massive financial barriers and aggressive legal contracts will somehow permanently protect us from the sudden, terrifying human tragedies that inevitably strike every single existence on this earth. The specific individuals who will actually save your fragile life when the complex corporate systems completely collapse and your massive digital bank accounts become utterly useless are the exact same silent, invisible service workers you arrogantly walk past every single day without ever making basic eye contact. If this specific story forced you to recognize the profound, quiet dignity of the hard-working people silently maintaining the fragile world around you, share it immediately with someone who desperately needs to understand that true, lasting power always resides entirely in unshakable human compassion. Leave a comment below about a specific time a complete stranger bravely showed up for you when the rest of the wealthy world completely looked away, because those are the only human stories that actually matter in the end. See you in the next one.